All right, we want to take up our theme of particularly preserving true religion. And I was reading an article where I found an interesting quotation from the Second Scots Book of Discipline from 1578. Assuming that you weren't all reading that recently, I thought I could try a quotation. It's very interesting, I think. It says, 1578, so just as the Scottish Church is trying to organize itself and get its life in order, by an act of Parliament in 1560, all of Scotland overnight moved from being Roman Catholic to Reformed. Now, that's not to say every individual followed the act of Parliament, but what it meant is that in 1560, all of a sudden, there was this explosion of need for preachers, and no organization, no order in the life of the church. So they were really laboring in these early years. And in the second book of Discipline, they wrote, "As the pastors and doctors should be diligent in teaching and sowing the seed of the word, so the elders should be careful in seeking the fruit of the same in the people." I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about the work of the eldership. They are to be seeking the fruit of the word in the lives of the people. Are they seeing the word blossom? Are they seeing the word take root? Are they observing the word? As the ministers must preach faithfully, so the elders have to observe faithfully. And according to Article 32, part of the work of the office bearers of the church is to promote concord, unity, and obedience. Now, sometimes unity and obedience can feel like they're at odds with each other. And sometimes in experience they can be. But it's trying to produce and cultivate that beautiful harmony of unity and obedience that is the job of the council, and perhaps particularly the job of elders as they seek to advance discipline. And as I was saying last time, discipline must in the first place be seen not as something negative, but something positive, something upbuilding. Perhaps a good analogy would be to think of the life of an athlete. An athlete has to discipline himself to accomplish his goal, but generally speaking, an athlete doesn't see his discipline as negative, but as positive. If I want to reach my goals, there's only one way to do that, and that's by the disciplines that are required. It's hard to believe now, but when I was in high school, I was a swimmer, and I was actually a fairly good swimmer, except I talked to the one woman on the team who actually swam in the nationals. She was a very good swimmer, and I said to her once, "What do you think about when you're swimming?" And she said, "All I think about is I've got to win, I've got to win, I've got to win." Well, I swam the 400 freestyle, and all I thought about was, I'll never finish, I'll never finish. I knew I was not the stuff of champions at that moment, but discipline should not be seen primarily in negative terms. It's the same with education, isn't it? There are various approaches to education. In the medieval and Renaissance world, by and large, the people with the very worst reputation were Latin teachers, who are notorious for beating the students for failing to learn Latin. Well, it is one way to learn Latin. But Augustine in his Confession said, education goes better when the appeal is made to the curiosity of the student. Now, maybe there's a limited curiosity in students about the ablative case. But generally speaking, I think it's right to say education should proceed initially on the basis of what is positive in education, evoking interest, stimulating curiosity, helping people see the value of these things. And that, I think, is the same for us in our Reformed churches. We have to help people see the value of things. And we have to help them see the value of things, especially from the Scriptures. I may try to talk about this a little more this evening, but we've had a number of good recent books defending traditional Reformed worship against the onslaught of contemporary worship. But too much of the time in those books, I think, is spent talking about the theology and the history of worship, which is a very, far be it for me to speak against history. That's a very worthwhile thing to do. But in the end of the day, we have to convince people that our worship is biblical. That's the crucial thing. And that's the thing that ultimately is going to convince people to listen to us when we talk about worship. So all of us need to be involved in this process of promoting edification, promoting the building up of the body through positive discipling. And one of the critical ways of doing that in the Dutch Reformed tradition, one of the unique ways of doing that in the Dutch Reformed tradition has been through the practice of family visiting. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, it's not the only way you build up the congregation. The congregation is built up in public worship. The congregation is built up in various educational opportunities. The congregation is built up as they carefully observe the Sabbath as a time to grow in grace. The congregation is built up in terms of family worship and devotions in the family. The congregation is built up in fellowship. I think sometimes we undervalue the importance of Christian fellowship. Fellowship is not a mark of the church. It doesn't help us identify the church. But it certainly must be a characteristic of the church. God's people are encouraged when they spend time with God's people. The Apostle Paul did warn, bad company corrupts good morals. It's true. And while there are dangers in fellowship, there are huge strengths in fellowship that need to be encouraged. We talked earlier about one danger, the danger of gossip. And you know the way to get over that is just say, we don't gossip, we share so that we can pray more effectively. A really cynical thing to say. So, yeah, there's a danger that fellowship becomes gossip. The other danger is that we so enjoy fellowship that we don't have any time or space for anybody else. And I know I feel that in myself when I go to our church. Our church is something under 500 people, and a lot of the people I only see on Sunday, and I come out of church and I see people that I really like and I want to go talk to. And then I see somebody I don't know. And I think, I really don't want to talk to that person. I'm being honest here for the moment. I've been fairly honest today. But I don't want to talk to that person. I don't have anything in common. I don't know who that person is. Why do I have to go and make small talk when I can really have some very enjoyable, small talk with people I already know? I think this is something we all have to work on, and maybe preachers have to help people think about more. How do we welcome people? How do we enfold people? How do we ensure that it's not just a smile and a handshake and good to have you here, and that's all the effort that's ever made to really enfold them? I know when we moved to our church in Escondido, one of the big problems was the congregation was dominated by 4 huge clans that had intermarried. And we had a babysitter who came to babysit for us who was related to 2 or 3 of the big clans. And she said, I just had a new first cousin born. I said, well, how many first cousins do you have? She said, this makes an even 100. Well, I think at least half those cousins were in our congregation. Well, if you're going to have coffee with the cousins after church, there's never going to be a Sunday left over to have coffee with anybody else. And this is a problem, not of every church certainly, but it illustrates the problem of how do we help people think through, how do we take time for new folks, not just to say hello, or even just to talk to them for a few minutes after church, but to actually begin to help them feel like they belong. One of the things we did in our congregation getting off track, we started an adult Sunday school program. Now, if you're, not raised Dutch Reformed, then that doesn't sound like a radical thing to do. But in the Dutch Reformed tradition in America, there wasn't adult Sunday school. That was just not something the old Dutch Reformed did. There used to be, long ago, men's societies. That's what Dutch Reformed people did. But men's societies died out and were not replaced by adult Sunday school. And so when I moved to Escondido 32 years ago, there was an adult Sunday school class of 12 people of a church of about 500. And so they asked if I'd teach, and I've been teaching it whenever I'm in town ever since, and it's been a wonderful experience to really, at least in one way, get to know people. And the other thing that I have really appreciated, our congregation is largely a blue-collar congregation. I think it's great for seminary faculty to have to learn how to talk to blue-collar people. I don't know that I've succeeded, but occasionally I make a joke and they laugh, so somebody's listening. Well, what I discovered was, and this is the epitome of my creativity, Steve Eric, so write this down. What I discovered was that we began the Sunday school class with a Bible passage, and we'd go around the room and everybody'd read one verse. That doesn't seem too problematic, does it? Except that half of our congregation, at least, were immigrants for whom English was a second language. Having to read a verse out of the Bible out loud in English, conflicted with their sort of cultural upbringing of a measure of shyness, and B, forced them to read a language that was not their native language out loud when they knew they had an accent and were a little embarrassed by it sometimes. And so we put an end to that. And then the Sunday school class began to grow. We now have about 200 people in Sunday school every Sunday. Now, I should, in the interest of honesty, admit we also somewhere along the line began to serve coffee and cookies. And so free coffee and cookies may have had something to do with the growth of the Sunday school class. But I suddenly realized it will be much easier in this church to get people involved in a large group educational activity than it would be to get them involved in a small group educational activity because of some of the uniqueness of our congregation. And so you have to look and think about what's going on, but it's an exercise in edification. The Lord doesn't require anybody to go to Sunday school, but if people show no interest in being involved in things that will help them grow spiritually, that ought to be of concern to us. And that brings us then to the matter of family visits. As one way in which elders and ministers connect with the congregation, but also a way in which this process of edification goes on. If we are visiting families regularly, then it is not a negative form of discipline. Nobody's being singled out. Nobody's being confronted. This is simply part of the edification process that goes on in our churches and with which many people are familiar. And so our church order does, in this very brief way, in Article 14, list as one of the things that elders are to do is, quote, engage in family visiting. It's interesting that the article says nothing about the frequency of family visiting, which I think historically has been a big issue in our churches and a big issue of concern as to how we should understand it, how we should practice it. And I think as we try to think through the issue of frequency, unless the church order has been amended. I don't know. I didn't have the most recent church order, but I doubt that would be amended. Obviously, the intention is to leave a certain measure of flexibility to the local council, but we have to address this question of frequency. And I think what happened is that in the Christian Reformed Church in the older days, the expectation was, I think it was in the church order, that family visiting would be done annually. The expectation is every family in the church would be visited once a year. Often that didn't get done. Family visiting, at least in my experience, is the greatest single source of guilt feelings among the eldership. In Escondido, it was particularly bad. Every elders meeting, we wouldn't just ask for a report on who had done family visiting. We would go around the table, and every elder would be asked, what family visits do you have to report? And of course, that meant you'd have to say, if you hadn't been on any, none to report. And then you'd get the stern look from the clerk. But frequency then is a crucial issue, isn't it? Well, I don't know, this may still be in the category of reformed comfort, that is, cheer up, things could be worse. As far as I know, the origins of family visiting are to be found in Calvin's day in Geneva, when there was great concern on the part of the ministers and elders that although everyone was required to attend church in Geneva, there was fear that lots of people didn't really understand the faith and were not necessarily really living disciplined lives. And so the decision was made that every family should be visited by elders or elders and ministers before every communion, which meant in Geneva that family visiting took place 4 times a year with every family. Now, in Geneva, it was, in one sense, a little easier because you could do family visiting by just going from house to house to house to house. Everybody was a member of the church. I think one of the huge problems with family visiting in many places today is the travel time to get from home to home to home. And the whole evening, it can seem, is taken up just with travel time. But again, on the idea that we can be comforted by not having to do what our forefathers did. When the Dutch Reformed churches were first organizing themselves at Wesel in 1568, the church order adopted there said every family was to be visited every week. See, don't you feel better already? Things could be worse. Now, what's going on there? Well, probably it was a very small group, and probably the concern was how to support one another in the face of persecution and one thing or another. But this quickly comes also then to the issue, doesn't it? How many elders do there need to be to do the work? How many elders does a congregation need to be able effectively to do family visiting? It depends how often you're going to do it. And then you have the question, well, what if our congregation just doesn't have that many people to stand up for leadership? What are we going to do? These are all things that are going to have to be worked through locally, but are part of the serious planning that the council needs to do to get family visiting done effectively. Now, I want to read to you from, it's recorded in Mansma and Vendelen, the book I referred to earlier, what the Dutch Reformed Fathers at Wesel said about the function of family visiting. The elder shall faithfully investigate whether the church members manifest themselves uprightly in walk and conduct, in the duties of godliness, in the faithful instruction of their households in the matter of family prayers, morning and evening, and such like matters. They shall admonish them to these duties with consideration, but also in all seriousness and according to the conditions and circumstances. They shall admonish them to steadfastness, or strengthen them to patience, or spur them on to a serious-minded fear of God. Such as need comfort and admonition, they shall comfort and admonish. And if need be, they shall report a matter to their fellow elders, who together with them are appointed to exercise discipline. And besides these matters, they shall correct that which can be corrected according to the gravity of the sin committed. Nor shall they neglect each one in his own district to encourage them to send their children to catechism. Now, this is intriguing to hear, in a sense, how much the vision of family visiting back then is somewhat parallel to the vision of family visiting that I think has continued among us. It is to be a spiritual visit with spiritual focus. And it's interesting that P.Y. de Young, in his book on family visiting, waxes very eloquent that elders have to beware of a number of things. Beware of it becoming a social visit. He said it's very easy for it just to become an occasion where we're all chazelach, where we're all just hospitable together. Now, he says there's nothing wrong with a social visit, but that's not what family visiting is all about. He goes on to say, don't let it become too focused on, I guess we'd call them psychological problems. He says, this is no place to help the alcoholic. He says that isn't sufficiently spiritual in focus. Now, he'd go on to say, if someone's an alcoholic and you discover that in family visit, it needs to be dealt with, but that's not what the family visit is about. It's about more particularly spiritual issues. How is your spiritual life going? Now, again, he's not saying if you have no social life and are lonely, that can become a spiritual issue. If you're an alcoholic, that clearly has spiritual dimensions. But the focus of the visit is on the spiritual condition of the family. He also says it's all right to read the Bible, but don't talk about it. That's making it a little blunter than he was. But he said there is something of a temptation for an elder to read a passage of Scripture and then begin to exposit it. And he says that's fine to do, but there's not time for that. You're not there to be an expositor of the Scripture. You're there, above all else, to be an inquirer after the spiritual health of the family and a listener to the answer. And I guess the thing that has most impressed me in terms of the family visiting I've done is it doesn't take very long at all to sense whether this is a spiritual family where things are going pretty well or where this is a spiritual family where things are not going very well. I don't know if some of you older elders have had exactly that experience. A spiritual family is kind of eager to receive you, eager to talk about spiritual things, eager to talk about the church. On the other hand, you get families that are clearly nervous that you're there, and you get the feeling they'll be very glad to see the end of you, and you're not sure about how honest the answers are. It has not been a wasted evening, because you've really learned something important about a family and about what's going on in that family. And we have to be very, very sensitive to that. The family visit can't set everything right, but it can begin to sort of diagnose what's going on in the family. If the family doesn't seem to be doing well, then you can inquire and try to get a sensitivity. How much are they involved in the life of the church? Are they in church twice on the Lord's Day? Ideally, we know that before we arrive, but maybe we don't. How are the children involved in the life of the church, and are they at the Christian school? What's going on with the children? How are they reacting? How are they feeling part of things? What kinds of other activities for fellowship or for education or for service are members of the family involved in? And again, this is not that we make absolute requirements of all of these things, but you get a very good sense of how involved this family is, where their real interests are. And maybe try to get them talking about where do they spend their time. That's often very revealing, and they may think that they're now off spiritual matters and be relieved, but they may reveal a great deal about the values of the family and the commitments of the family. This, as I say, is crucial and doesn't need to take a lot of time. I think in the old days, the expectation often was you could visit 3 families in the evening. That's what I experienced when I was young. that family visiting was set. So that means you're there 45 minutes to an hour, maybe, most. But you can learn an amazing amount about the spiritual health of a family in that brief time. And can really help then elders to begin to think about how can we go about meeting some of the needs that we're sensing maybe in more than one family. How can we focus in some helpful way on this family or that family to help them? You see, I think one of the biggest problems we have with family visiting is the often unasked question, is it really worth the time and effort? Because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Is it really worth it? Are we really learning anything profitable? Monsma wrote that family visiting was one of the denominational strongholds that we have. And I'm inclined to think this is right. In that it does precisely what I was talking about in the last hour of really connecting the elders with the people. It helps the elders experience that they're not just members of a board of trustees that oversee what's going on. It really helps the members to realize that they have to give account and that elders are concerned for them. I remember once in a sermon, I don't think I'd planned to say it, it just sort of came to me as I was preaching, and I was talking about how sometimes, it's good to have some external stimulus to encourage you to do good things. And I paused and I said, like the way we all start family devotions when we know the elders are coming for family visiting, so that we can report that we have, well, I was amazed at how much laughter I got out of that. I think it was a little discouraging, actually. But think about it. Let's assume for the moment that there are lots of families out there that only start devotions because the elders are coming. Isn't it good that they started devotions? Isn't there at least a chance they'll keep on doing it a little while after the elders leave? I can remember one of my happier experiences was when my 6-year-old daughter, we had some seminarians over for Sunday afternoon dinner, and after dinner we got out the Bible, and my daughter, with the impish look only she could have, said, Daddy, why do we only read the Bible when we have guests? What do you say? I mean, pardon me? Yeah, right, yeah, they need it, yeah. We didn't only read when there were guests. You see, this is exactly what family visiting is intended to do. It's intended to get the family doing a little thinking about how it's doing spiritually, both before the elders arrive and when they're there. And to try to encourage them to put their house in order. We can all get kind of sloppy if there's no accountability. That's why almost all athletes who are really becoming distinguished athletes have coaches. You don't do it just on your own. You have encouragement, you have direction, you have help, and that's what our family visiting was intended to do, and I think is still worth the time and effort to do. I do think it is one of the strongholds in the sense of being an institution builder. It builds institutional connection. My church isn't just officers who are off there and a congregation doing their own thing, but there is really contact. There's really communication. Now, another danger in family visiting is that it can descend into being an opportunity to criticize the minister or criticize the church. Now, I happen to believe that it is appropriate near the end of the family visit to say, are you appreciating the church? Is the church meeting your needs? So that they have an opportunity to voice some criticisms they may have of the life of the church. But I think the primary focus of family visiting is not on somebody else's weaknesses. It's on whatever weaknesses may be going on in the family that the elders can speak to and think about and encourage people in their walk with the Lord. So we have to really plan and be analytical. And the planning is not just, are we going to have a theme for this year's family visit? Now, I think having a theme is not altogether a bad idea. It should be a theme that focuses rather personally on the life of the family. It can be something like, how is the Sabbath going? How do you prepare for the Lord's Supper? Do you have any kind of family worship? There can be a variety of things that can be examined, but what you all want to get at is the family growing in the faith? That's the heart of the matter. And how can we encourage that? But in that planning, before we get to that stage, we do have to ask all of these analytical questions. How often are we going to try to visit? If we don't have a clear notion, we won't get it done. How often are we going to try to visit? What is the character of the congregation? Because it's going to affect the time committed to family visiting. How big is the congregation relative to the number of elders that we have? How geographically spread out is the congregation? Are we divided as a congregation into elder districts or not? I have mixed feelings about districts. It seems to me almost everywhere has districts now. In the old days, we didn't have districts. Although they seem to have districts at Basel, so I suppose I shouldn't be critical of districts. I'm beginning to think if we're going to have districts, we probably ought to try to have them organized geographically, because it will help get around on the visits. If the districts are just kind of arranged willy-nilly, then every poor elder trying to visit his district has to go here, there, and everywhere. I'm not saying this is true everywhere, but it may be helpful if the districts can be more organized geographically so people can be reached more quickly. Now, family visiting, or Hausbesuch, house visiting as it used to be known, does imply that the elders go to the house. And I think those who've said that's important and good are right. I think it's good for the elders to be in the house. You can tell a lot about a family from what the house looks like. But maybe in a church where it's very hard to get around geographically, maybe not every family visit has to be at the home. Maybe some can be at the church. I remember, again, when I was young, or I guess just new in Escondido, a lot of the single people would come to the church to meet with elders. Now, that's a little hard on the single people maybe, and maybe that shouldn't be the universal practice, but in a church with a lot of single people, it's hard to get to make all of those visits individually. Now, in most of your churches, do you still have widow visits? Is that still a fairly common practice? Yes and no. I see a variety of... yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's very important. That's what I was going to suggest. I think in our church, we have the elders doing widow visits along with the deacons. And I think that's a nice idea. But I think if the elders are really stressed, the deacons could take up the widow visits. I think widow visits are a really good idea. I saw that with my mother-in-law. She lives with us. She's not lonely. She's not neglected. And she really resisted widow visits when it first started. She wasn't used to it. She didn't see the point of it. But it's been a wonderful way for her to get to know people in the congregation. And it really has come to mean a lot to her. And I was intrigued to observe that. Again, I think we need to be a little creative. Not every widow necessarily needs the same amount of attention. I was struck that Paul sort of talks that way in 1 Timothy 5, I think it is. That, younger widows aren't going to need as much attention as older widows. Widows with a lot of family in the congregation don't need the same kind of attention that widows are pretty much alone. I think we need to be a little more flexible and adaptable. But if elders are stressed out, I think the widow visits maybe can be given more to the deacons, who are, after all, called to provide relief and comfort. So we have to analyze the congregation, then we have to analyze the eldership. Do we have enough elders to do this? If we don't have enough elders to do it in a reasonable fashion, is there some is there some way of either adding to the eldership overall or maybe adding short-term just for the family visiting? I was talking to our new pastor, relatively new, Chris Gordon, and he said in Linden in the URC church, they tried often to get all the family visiting done in a week or two. And yeah, it took every night, and it was demanding and kind of exhausting, but then it was over. And then I remember in Alameda when I was a kid in the Christian Reformed Church, the elders sent out the list. The elders will be visiting you at this time on this day. And the expectation is, you be there. I don't want to hear about your busy life. I have a busy life too. Be there. Now, you know, they were not absolutely hard-nosed about this, but I think often they put it on the congregation. If you need to switch, look at the list and switch with somebody and let us know. I know I used to seemed endless amounts of time on the phone as an elder just trying to set up the visit, finding someone who would receive us. And I think some of this is appropriate. If this is important, the congregation has to take it as important. The congregation has to see there's a seriousness to this that we expect them to cooperate with. This is not a matter just of convenience. This is a matter of spiritual ministry to which we are called by our church order and is, we believe, important to the spiritual well-being, and you have to cooperate in this. Now, I'm not saying that doing it all in a week or two is good for every congregation, but if you did it like that, maybe you could enlist some former elders to help out. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, just sort of off the top of my head. But in any case, we ought to be trying to think creatively of ways how we can get this done and get it done efficiently. Way too often in Escondido, I would find myself going out to make one family visit in an evening. And then it becomes kind of social, and we have coffee and cookies, and it's all very nice. But the night is gone, and only one family has been visited. And often, it seemed to me it was a family where I thought to myself, this is one of the better families in church. Maybe that's why they're available, and if we hadn't come here, it wouldn't have been so bad. But it's not really getting to what family visiting is all about. So we need to be, I think, trying to find as much creativity. As I say, the problem of travel time becomes immense, at least for us in California. People are just all scattered over. You can spend half hour, 45 minutes driving from one home to another with no trouble at all. It needs to be organized better than that to try to save that kind of time. We have to communicate that the children need to be present. Again, I think that was sort of taken for granted in the old days. The kids would just be there. Now, I remember last time I was an elder and doing family visiting, half the time we'd get there, the kids couldn't be here tonight. Well, we have to communicate that's not acceptable. We've come for the family. And it's important that we get some read on how the kids are doing also. So again, this has to be organized in a way. Again, we don't want to be heavy-handed, but we have to communicate that this is serious business, and the congregation has to take it seriously as well. Ideally, the ministers should be involved in some of the family visits. Each minister will have to evaluate how busy he is, how much time he has, but I think ministers have to be on some of the family visits to get some sense of what's being said, what's being heard in the congregation. Another serious issue, I think, is what do we do after the visit? I think if visiting is going to be significant, there has to be an honest report of what happened in the visit. I don't think it's so hard to report honestly on the elder's appraisal of how the family is doing spiritually. But I think sometimes it is hard to report on some of the criticisms that may be voiced about the church or more particularly about the minister. And I don't know the best way of handling that. But I think we have to be honest. If people aren't happy with the preaching, somebody needs to hear that. And probably the minister needs to hear it. Now, just because people are unhappy with the preaching doesn't mean the preaching's bad. But if some people are unhappy about it, it ought to be something that's heard in the consistory and addressed one way or another. I think that's crucial. Some ministers have very thin skin. I'm one of them. Nobody likes to be criticized. We all go into the ministry because we know everyone will like us. One of the better bits of advice Dr. Bergsma used to give seminarians was, just remember, boys, 5% of the people will hate you even before they meet you. And I've heard several people say that's too low a percentage. But we have to have honest communication. We have to have effective record keeping. Not every comment needs to be kept in the records, but we need clear records of when families were visited. And the clerk needs to keep that, it seems to be, and maybe each district elder needs to keep it for his own district, so that we really have to face when was the last time this family was visited. I think our family once went 5 years in Escondido without a visit. Well, I think what happened is the elders were busy, and they thought, well, that family doesn't really need a visit. Well, we do need a visit. And so record keeping is very important. And then we have to ask, does one of the families or all the families visited need some kind of follow-up? Was there some problem revealed that we really need to address? And one of my concerns about districts is that I fear too often an elder may have a district in which somebody has a problem that the elder of the district is not the ideal one to deal with. Maybe the elder is somehow a family relation, or maybe the elder just doesn't have the personality. Who knows what the problem is? But there may be someone on the consistory who really is close to that person or has some other avenue of connection. And if we get too, one of the great Dutch strengths is organization, and one of the Dutch weaknesses is inflexibility with organization. So I think we have to ask, if we need follow-up, who can best follow up? I think that's sometimes true with a death in the congregation. It maybe isn't always the family elder who's the best elder to go to a particular grieving family. There ought to be some. I remember pre-district in some of the churches I've been in, the question would arise: who should go? Who's the best person to go? And I think there may be some usefulness to some of that at least operating. Of course, one thing that may be important is a pastoral visit. It doesn't have to be announced as following up on a family visit, but maybe there's something particular the minister could do. In any case, if there are families that need a particular follow-up, that ought to be planned. Or if the elders are hearing a common sort of response, then maybe some program needs to be looked at that could address short-term, long-term, some particular problem. This is why getting the family visits done and reported can be helpful, because you can catch the temperature of the congregation at a moment, at a particular time in its history, to see how we're doing, where things are going. So I hope that is somewhat helpful as we think about the matter of family visits, to see that it is a form of discipline, a positive discipline, a nurturing discipline, and also a remarkably informative experience for the eldership and for the ministers in terms of how things are going. Sometimes things will be going well. Sometimes things will be going with struggle. I always remember talking to an old Orthodox Presbyterian minister, and I said to him, "How are things going at the church?" And he said, "Great for a church." And I think that revealed a lot. My grandmother used to say, "There's no heaven on earth, don't look for it." And there's a lot of truth to that. The church necessarily has struggles. But sometimes there are greater seasons of struggle than other times. And it's very important that the ministers and the elders be united in trying to pursue the harmony, the unity, and the obedience of the congregation through smart institutions that build the brethren up in the faith. Okay, Paul Murphy is standing with the microphone.
Wait.
Can everybody see me all right down here? I saw Mr. Murphy up in the pulpit, and he and I are similarly vertically challenged. And I'm afraid if I get up in that pulpit, you won't be able to see anything more than a talking head. I remember the first time I preached in Escondido, our several times former pastor, Reverend Hauerzaw, was fairly tall, and so I preached, and the pulpit hit me about here, and it was great in Escondido because, did you want to check? Because the Dutch immigrants that were the majority in our church were delightfully straightforward, telling you exactly what they thought. And so one of the ladies in the church shook my hand at the door, and she said, "Well, it was a good sermon, but why don't you get a box so we can see you?" And I thought that was a very helpful bit of advice, so she's putting a new battery in there, and we'll get started anyway, and she can be free to interrupt. I'm intrigued that in Article 30 of the Belgian Confession, we are reminded not only of the responsibility of the Council to preserve true religion, but also the responsibility to propagate true religion. And I like the kind of balancing of what we might call the defensive and the offensive. And I fear that in America, I think she should take over. She clearly knows what she's doing. Great, thank you. I think in America, we in the Reformed community have been, understandably but regretfully, too much on the defensive. We recognize that we're a small minority. We recognize that we're frequently criticized. We recognize that we're under a lot of pressure, and the danger, the temptation is that we adopt as our theme song the old fundamentalist hymn, "Hold the Fort, for I am coming." It's one of the many reasons I'm a psalm singer, but it's this defensive attitude that you know there really is no way to go forward, and the only thing to do is to try to hold on until the end comes. It's sort of the white knuckle approach to religion. It's just hold on. And we do need to work at preserving true religion, but we also need to work at propagating true religion. It has sometimes been argued that the great confessions of the 16th century are not very good at encouraging us in propagation. It has been alleged that they don't have a lot to say about evangelism or about missions, and I'm not here to argue that maybe they couldn't say more, but I want to argue they didn't say nothing, and they say plenty to encourage us in the propagation of true religion. Heidelberg Catechism 86 reminds us that one of the reasons that we seek to live godly lives is that by our godly walk, our neighbors also may be won for Christ. There at the Heidelberg Catechism, there is an awareness that there are those who do not know Christ and His gospel, and that part of the passion of our living for Christ is that those who do not know Him might come to know Him. Even more pointedly, in the Canons of Dort, who looks for evangelistic marching orders in the Canons of Dort? But in the second head of doctrine, Article 5, we have this very important statement from the Great Synod. The promise of the gospel is that whosoever believes in Christ crucified shall not perish, but have eternal life. This promise together with the command to repent and believe, ought to be declared and published to all nations and to all persons promiscuously and without distinction, to whom God out of his good pleasure sends the gospel. Now, there's a pretty all-embracing, all-encompassing vision. All nations, all persons should hear the gospel wherever Christ sends us. The Belgic Confession, in several articles, should stimulate our thought on this point. All men, Article 28 says, are in duty bound to join and unite themselves with the church. If this is a universal obligation, it's a universal responsibility for the church to help people to fulfill their obligation. Or Article 30 of the Belgic Confession, the true doctrine is to be everywhere propagated. Or even in the statement, Article 36 on the magistrates are to allow, quote, the preaching of the word of the gospel everywhere, that God may be honored and worshiped by everyone. So here really is a universal vision of the church with a responsibility to all mankind. And we need to take that very seriously. We need to be engaged in that task. One of the things that often struck me as an outsider, that's a technical term in the old days in Dutch Reformed churches. It referred to any non-Dutch person or Frisian person who came to church. And so I understood that I was an outsider when, as a high school kid, I started attending a Dutch Reformed congregation. And one of the things that struck me, even way back then as an outsider, was these people love their church. They cherish their church. They believe in the truthfulness of their church. And they can't imagine that anyone else would want to worship here. It was really a curious sense of superiority and inferiority bound together. And I think we have to do better than that. We have to try, at least, to do better than that, because our whole heritage is a heritage of propagating true religion everywhere. In the 16th century, the Reformed lived and died to carry Christ's gospel far and wide to places where it had not been heard. And the origins of the modern missionary movement are really to be found in Calvinism. And the first missionary institute was started by Dutch Calvinists at the University of Leiden in the early 17th century. So it is not that these themes are not richly present in our background. But it is true that I think they have somewhat been weakened among us because of this sense that we're such a small minority, we're just barely holding on, and we need to have more zeal, more commitment, and I'm delighted that there's going to be this discussion tomorrow morning about how we can move forward. Lest I forget to say it later, let me try to offend everyone here. I don't want to leave anybody out. It's part of my universal goal in speaking. I do think one of the areas in which our United Reformed Church order is deficient is not providing better organization for the work of home missions and foreign missions. I understand why we reacted in our founding the way we did, but I think we have overreacted, and that's always a danger of a new movement in its founding, to overreact. We need to use those great skills of organization to use the resources we have in our denomination to effectively and efficiently provide for home missions and for foreign missions in a way that connects with congregations, so congregations feel real connection to the work of home missions and foreign missions. I think that was a failure often in our old connection, but that still we're not asking each congregation to do all the work of figuring everything out relative to these great tasks. Now, we've talked about the commitment to discipline that our churches have, and I think we often feel that maybe discipline is one of the obstacles to really seeing our churches grow and flourish. Is discipline kind of off-putting to people in a way that harms the life of our churches? And I think we have to say, frankly, it may be in some cases. Remember, we had a graduate many years ago now, went to a small Orthodox Presbyterian church where there had been many people who visited, many people who came from a time and then went on. And he undertook, idealistic young man, undertook to visit as many people as he could contact who had either visited or for a time worshiped in that congregation to try to ask them, why didn't they stay? And he visited a lot of people and came away with this recurring theme. We didn't stay because your church required too much commitment. And he came away saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that as a pastor. How do you get over being too committed? Do you really want to get the church to demand less commitment? Again, it's just part of the struggle we face in the context in which we face. At one of my son's church, they had an older couple visit, and they were having communion, and they made very clear that if you're not a member of the congregation or a sister church, you should not come to the Lord's table. And one of the elders sort of groaned and thought, here we have this visiting couple, and we make this announcement, and they're probably going to be really upset. And so they went up and talked to the couple after the service to try to explain and try to hope there wasn't any undue offense. And the couple said, we're going to keep coming here. We're really impressed that you people are serious about what you're doing. So these kinds of commitments, these kinds of acts of faithfulness, this kind of effort to take the Lord and His Word and His worship seriously, I do think resonate with some people. And we need to be aware of that and not be overly concerned that our call to commitment, our effort to practice commitment is going to be a failure. Now, our determination to propagate true religion has to, first of all, be in the congregation. That may be almost self-evident, but I don't think it is when you look at the character of much of American evangelicalism. American evangelicalism often has been relatively good at bringing in people from the outside into the church, and relatively bad about keeping people through the generations in the church. The Dutch Reformed historically have not been so hot at bringing people from the outside into the church and have been remarkably effective in keeping the generations in the church. And in trying to be more effective in reaching out, we have to be very sure that we don't lose our effectiveness in reaching down through the generations and losing our young people. And to that end, we have historically in our churches devoted a tremendous amount of time, energy, and money to education. To education in the church, and education through Christian schools, and education through Christian colleges. In fact, I was thinking about it and looking at the Christian Reformed history. It seems to me a little difficult to imagine a denomination that worked harder at the task of education. From junior high through high school, almost all the kids went to catechism classes. Most of the kids went to grammar school and high school, and if they went to college, went to Christian colleges. Through the years, it was a requirement that the Heidelberg Catechism be preached once on every Lord's Day, so that there was a serious doctrinal component regularly to preaching. And I've always said to my Presbyterian friends, I think there's a great heritage in catechism preaching because it forces you to preach on topics annually that many of us maybe wouldn't think to preach on otherwise. How many of us would preach 2 or 3 times a year on the Lord's Supper if the catechism didn't lead us to do that? And yet these are important doctrinal matters, important in the worshiping life of the community. And so all of this time, all of this energy going into education, and I say this not to demean the Christian Reformed Church because I profited so much spiritually from them, But I have to say, by the 1990s, what had all of this time and energy and money and education accomplished? How much did people know about sound doctrine in the pews? How much had they really learned? How much had the youth absorbed through all of this effort at education? And my conclusion has to be, sadly, little. Certainly, they did not acquire much discernment. They hadn't learned to think at all theologically, it seems to me, or I'm being a little over-exaggerating. But the level of ability to think theologically, to see the implications of ideas, to see why they were important, to understand the basics of our heritage, were just shockingly absent. They had many people adopted an attitude that you see in medieval religion called implicit faith. And implicit faith says, I don't need to know the truth. I only need to know that I trust the church, that whatever the church says is true. And I will follow the church, I'll rely on the church, I really don't need to know for myself. And that attitude had really grown up in our own heritage. And I think the great concern for us is, how do we ensure that doesn't happen among us? How can we ensure, to the best of our abilities, we're not the Holy Spirit. We always have to bear that in mind. Unless the Lord build the house, those who labor, labor in vain. But how, according to our callings and to the best of our ability, can we try to provide education that really educates, that really leads to knowledge, that really leads to discernment? And I think this has got to be a great concern for us in the church as a whole, but particularly relative to the younger generations in our church. How are we going to effectively pass on the heritage that is ours, that we think is precious, that we think is biblical, that we think is vital? How are we going to pass it on? How are we going to be sure that the next generation knows it? And in looking through the church order, one of the things that struck me is that while we get very little information about family visiting in the church order, we actually get a fair bit of reference to young people in the church order. We are reminded of the importance of their baptism and that they be presented by godly parents for baptism. We get a fair amount of reference to the responsibility of catechesis, that young people should be taught in the doctrines of the church and of the Bible regularly, consistently, faithful by the minister, helped by the elders. We have several references both to the meetings of classis and to the work of the church visitors in the local congregation, that they are to inquire as to whether the council is promoting godly schooling. And then we have references to the importance of encouraging profession of faith, so that young people at an appropriate age will be able to stand up before the congregation and own the covenant that was made for them in their baptism. And then we are reminded as ministers and elders and deacons of our responsibility to try to ensure that young people will marry in the Lord. So when you think about it, this is direction to us looking at most of the really important stages of development in young people, that it should take place in the church with the guidance of the church, that the Lord might be honored as those young people grow and as they develop. And that this really is a responsibility of trying to propagate true religion through the generations. And we have to ask ourselves then, how is this going? And at the question and answer session last time, I think, or the time before, one of the questions was raised: how are we to evaluate what seems to be an exodus of some of our young people from our churches? And again, I think we have to ask ourselves, how good a job have we done convincing them that the doctrines taught in our churches are biblical and crucial, important? It's not just a nice kind of frosting on the cake. Reformed theology is not the frosting on the evangelical cake. It is a distinctive understanding of religion and of religious life. How are we doing with that? And I think particularly catechesis has something we have to think about. How are we doing really communicating the catechism? I remember years ago I was asked at a conference, what kinds of teaching guides can we use to teach the catechism? What materials do you recommend? And I said, how about use the catechism? The catechism was written to be a teaching tool. And it's not that complicated. It's really remarkably straightforward. But at some point in our teaching, we have to get beyond just the what does the catechism say to why does the catechism make that point. The catechism doesn't talk about everything. Why does the catechism talk about the things it talks about? Why are those important to me in my Christian life? That's what we have to help young people see. And it's interesting in our church order, which I think reflects our history, that the assumption is that the ministers primarily will teach catechism. And yet I think increasingly ministers are not teaching catechism, or at least not teaching it except maybe juniors or seniors in high school. Now, I know ministers are really busy. And just as I was sensitive to the burdens placed on elders of work expectations that were unreasonable, we have to be very careful that we don't place upon ministers work expectations that are unreasonable. But I do think that while elders are relatively good at teaching the what of the catechism, they may not be so good at teaching the why of the catechism. Why are these things important? And I do think we as ministers have to think more carefully. If we don't have time to teach the catechism, are there helps for elders and others who may be teaching catechism to do it more effectively? So that the students don't just come away saying, yeah, we've heard that before. But are really at some level gripped by what's going on. Now, there are various ways to do that. I remember one of my sons had a dairyman as a catechism teacher in 7th grade, and I thought, I don't know how well this is going to do. I guess it was sort of snooty city boy kind of attitude, you know? And what's this dairyman going to do? He was the best catechism teacher I think that my son had, because he really made him memorize because he gave them candy if they memorized. And I thought, here is a born teacher. Here's a guy who knows his stuff. And it worked out actually very well indeed. So we have to look hard at this educational thing and ask, are we really creating a knowledgeable and discerning young people? Now, again, that's not always the easiest thing to do. We can't do it without the Holy Spirit. Young people occasionally seem to have other things on their mind than the Bible. But we have to keep at it. We have to keep working. We have to keep laboring. Now, on this marriage thing, one of the interesting things discussed at the Great Synod of Dort in the 17th century was, how are we going to get young people to learn their catechism better? And one of the suggestions made on the floor of the synod, let's not allow them to get married till they know their catechism. Now, you know, this is a possibility that we may want to resurrect. But it shows that this is a perennial problem that we work at and that we want to labor with. I think one of the issues that we feel particular pressure on is the question of what about young people and worship? How are we going to get young people to enter in to the worship of our churches? And of course, the most prevalent effort to solve this problem has been to change the worship, to make the young people feel more at home. And simply as a historian, I would say if you look back on the last 60 years, the two things that are most striking about the shifts in American Protestantism are, first of all, the growing decline of observing the Sabbath, And secondly, the dramatic change in public worship. I think if you went back 60 years ago and you visited a Baptist church and a Presbyterian church and a variety of other denominations and a Dutch Reformed church, you would not see strikingly different worship. There might be different songs, there might be somewhat different order of doing things, but there would be a certain Protestant consistency across many different denominational lines. I suppose you could say the same thing is true today. It's just that that old form of worship has almost entirely disappeared, and what I must call Pentecostal worship has taken its place. Now, I say that now not as a theologian and not as a critic, simply as a historian. The new contemporary worship comes from Pentecostal roots, is fed by a Pentecostal piety, and is largely inspired by Pentecostal references. Now, I can appreciate Pentecostals as much as anybody. I'm writing a book on Aimee Semple McPherson, my own personal Pentecostal favorite. And you will all want to buy one, and I'm hoping that, I'll get enough money for retirement out of this. But I can have a measure of appreciation for Pentecostalism. There are friends, but it's a fundamentally different way of understanding the Bible and of understanding church life and certainly of understanding worship. I don't think in the long run it is possible to have Pentecostal worship wed to Reformed theology. I don't think it works. The one will eventually drive out the other, and we know which usually drives out which. Abraham Kuyper, when he came to this country, said that America was clearly a Methodist country. And what he meant by that was it's a revivalist country. The Protestantism of America is dominated by revivalism, and if you're going to import into a Reformed church revivalistic music and revivalistic worship, eventually you're going to have revivalistic theology to accompany it. I think we ought to pray for our Korean Presbyterian brothers and sisters in Korea. They are awash and adrift and drowning in Pentecostalism that has come into their circles through worship, undermining their theology increasingly. It's a very serious problem over there. And it may not be as great a problem for us, but it's an issue we have to face and ask, how do we create in our young people a thoughtfulness about these issues? And realize that worship issues, many worship issues, maybe not all worship issues, many worship issues are not a matter of taste, but they're a matter of theology. Now, whether you sing psalms from the Blue Psalter hymnal or the Gray Psalter hymnal or from the Covenanter Psalter hymnal or from the Free Church of Scotland Psalter or from the upcoming OP Psalter or the upcoming URC Psalter, that's a matter of taste. But whether you sing psalms or not is not a matter of taste. Our heritage was built on the singing of psalms. Now, I'm not talking about the exclusive singing of psalms. When I was a high school kid in the late 50s coming into the Christian Reformed Church, every Christian Reformed church I attended, the pattern was about 4 psalms and 1 hymn. There was this predominance of the Psalter. And I am personally convinced, we don't have time to talk about this tonight, but I am personally convinced that there is a piety in the Psalter that gets communicated as congregations sing it and know it and love it, that puts steel in the soul, that equips for holy living in a world of opposition, that communicates a piety absent from a great deal of hymnody. And without getting at all into the question of exactly the percentage of hymns versus psalms, we need to be able to, with conviction, say to our young people, as well as to ourselves, our heritage of knowing the Psalms by singing them is one of our great treasures. I commend to you the recently translated book of Abraham Kuyper entitled Our Worship. Who would think that Abraham Kuyper is still bringing out new books? But it's a new translation of a book entitled Our Worship, and in there he talks about psalms and hymns. And he says, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I am longing and hoping for really great hymns to be written. And until that happens, let's keep singing the psalms. And then he says, comparing hymns to psalms is like comparing gilded lead to gold. For the first time, I felt some of Kuyper's power as a popular communicator in this book. It's very well done. But the point is pretty powerful. Can't we say to our young people, look, when you're singing the Psalms, you're singing God's Word. We quote the Bible verse about hiding God's Word in our hearts that we might not sin against Him. What better way to hide God's Word in our hearts than to sing His Word? This doesn't seem to me a hard case to make. But it's a case that needs to be made, that we have to make for the sake of our young people and for the sake of our own commitments, our own convictions. And that extends then to other parts of worship. I remember a few years back, now I'm afraid I'll step on toes, but I get to leave tomorrow. There was an RYS, Reformed Youth Service Convention, and some of the leadership of the convention was suggesting a variety of contemporary songs to sing, and some of the young people sat in the back of the hall and began to chant, Blue Psalter Hymnal, Blue Psalter Hymnal. Well, isn't that remarkable? What has it come to that the young people want to sing the Psalms and their youth leaders are inclined to try to teach them something else? You know, it shouldn't be all that surprising that if we say to young people, we know that what we do in church won't meet your spiritual needs, so let's do something really valuable in youth group meeting. The danger is they'll learn the lesson we're teaching them. And the lesson we're teaching them is the spiritual action isn't in the worship service, but it's in the special meetings where other things go on, where there's more spirit, there's more emotion, there's more energy going on. We have to be very careful about what we're communicating at that point. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss all contemporary music as useful, but I am saying if we are committed to serious, sober, Bible-centered singing and worship, then that's good for our young people as well as good for us. And we have to communicate that. And I think RYS has done a pretty good job in doing that in all sorts of ways. I'm very thankful for that. But we have to think about that. Now, in Southern California, we have a huge number of Korean immigrants who were Presbyterians, came to this country. There are something like 500,000 Koreans in Southern California, and a large percentage of them are Presbyterian. And one of the decisions they made when they came here was that for the older folks, they would continue to have their worship services in the Korean language. And their services are a fairly traditional American Presbyterian worship service. And that then they would have English language services for their children. And so in the American Korean Presbyterian churches, children are removed from the family at a very young age in church to go to services in English while their parents go to services in Korean. Now, it's an understandable decision, but it's a decision that ripped the covenant family apart. And while the Korean service was fairly traditionally Presbyterian, the English service was radically Pentecostal in terms of music and in terms of a lot of style of preaching. And what was communicated? That the piety of the parents was just old-fashioned, old country, irrelevant to young people. And then you see we come back to the pragmatic test and the pragmatic question. How has this worked out? all the statistics indicate that 95%, 98% in some polls, of Korean American Presbyterian young people after college leave the church. 95 to 98%. Leave the Korean American church. Now, they may go to some other church. This is a colossal failure by any pragmatic standard. And I think we have to learn from these experiences and say, what are we going to do with our young people? Now, I think one of the great heritages of the Dutch Reformed churches is to say children worship with their parents in church. We don't segregate them by age. So that from the very youngest years, they are absorbing in ways that we may not even fully grasp the worship service. I remember vividly one of my sons, when he was 5 years old, answering the door on a Sunday afternoon. A neighbor across the street said, "Can you come out and play?" And my son said, "Well, I don't think so. Where's our other neighbor that we usually play with?" "Well, I think he's gone to the store with his mother Sunday afternoon." My 5-year-old's eyes got big. He said, "Boy, is he in trouble." And the little boy who was across the street, unchurched, said, "Why's that?" And my son said, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh is a Sabbath unto the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do it." The whole commandment. I had no idea he'd memorized the Ten Commandments. I'd made no effort to have him memorize the Ten Commandments. He'd heard them every Sunday morning in church. Read from Exodus 20. Sometimes I've heard it said, often I've heard it said, well, isn't that kind of a vain repetition? There's nothing better for kids than vain repetition. Not vain, but repetition. And they absorb so much more than we imagine or understand. But we have to focus, you see, creative, thoughtfully on this question. How do we pass the faith down through the generations? And I don't think it's by segregating them out or by subtly communicating that what's going on in church is somehow irrelevant or doesn't apply to them or isn't important. Well, we also need to think, and I'm out of time, we also need to think of beyond the congregation. See, I'm really Dutch Reformed. I only think in the congregation. But we want to think beyond the congregation. How do we reach outside the congregation? And the most important thing is just to realize our responsibility to do that. And then, I think, try to put ourselves in the position of the outsider. I know in our church in Escondido, I have sometimes thought, if I were a visitor to this church and I drove up on a Sunday morning, I wouldn't know what door to go in. That's a pretty simple thing, isn't it? But we come every week, we know what door to go in. We might think to ourselves, if we have a visitor, they ought to be smart enough to follow the crowd. But you see, are we welcoming? Are we really being thoughtful about how what we're doing is going to affect those who are visiting with us? I remember at one point, a number of years ago, we had a serious overcrowding problem in our church. It was a great problem to have, but it's a real problem. What do you do? And we had a discussion amongst the elders, and one of the elders said, well, I guess we need to found a daughter congregation. Another said, I guess we need to build a new building. And one of the elders said, well, if they just came 10 minutes earlier, there'd be a seat. Well, that's perfectly true, isn't it? And it's clearly the cheapest option. But you see, it shows a real insensitivity to the problem of being a visitor. And so, although I'm not big on a lot of church growth stuff, I think we ought to take seriously when they say, you know, if somebody visits a church and it's more than 80% full, people feel like they're taking somebody else's seat and they won't stay. That's something to ponder. That's something to think about. So we have to, I think, try to think in that creative way. How do we come across? How can we explain what we're doing in the service? In the old days, I always remember I opened my bulletin in a Christian Reformed church, and the first thing you read was votum and salutation. Well, if you'd studied Latin and knew what a votum was, it was not a bad way to begin. But, maybe we could translate votum into English. Maybe, it wouldn't destroy the church. Now, I feel passionately that we should not apologize for using vocabulary that the apostles used in the Scripture. There are people who say, well, we shouldn't use big words like justification in church. People won't understand what it means. Well, Paul used the word justification. They weren't so much smarter in the ancient world than we are today. I think we can explain those things. We can define those things. We don't have to run away from them. It would be good to exercise ourselves in thinking, how will people see us when they visit us? What are the things they might find off-putting that we could change easily without any betrayal of our principles and our commitments? And so we can do that locally. I think we need to labor to try to use more gifts of people other than office bearers. Now, I don't know if you've had trouble here. If I were giving this lecture in the Southwest classes, I'd step on a few toes. We have some very high churchmen in the Southwest classes. Ministers and elders should do everything. And the function of laymen is to sit and listen. And occasionally pay. More than occasionally. But our doctrinal standards do not say that the office bearers are to do everything. And we have to be careful in a world that undervalues office bearers generally, not to overreact and then overvalue office bearers. The Belgian Confession, Article 28, says, all men as spiritual members of the same body, that means all people, as mutual members of the same body, serving the edification of the brethren according to the talents God has given them. All of us are to serve the edification of all of us according to the talents God has given us. If you don't believe that, you're not really Reformed. I love to be able to say things like that. We have to use all of the gifts of the members. Or Heidelberg Catechism 55. What does it mean that we believe in the communion of the saints? First, that believers, all and every one, as members of Christ, are partakers of Him and of all His treasures and gifts. Second, that everyone must know himself bound to employ his gifts readily and cheerfully for the advantage and salvation of other members. We all have a responsibility to serve. We have all been given lavish gifts from Christ, and we're to use those gifts to serve one another. That's the communion of the saints that we confess. That's critical for our life together. So much more that could be said, and you're now fearing I will. Let me just conclude briefly with one point. None of this, I used to say, I don't think a church ever had things better on paper than the Christian Reformed Church. I don't think the doctrine was ever any better. I don't think the form of subscription was ever any better. I don't think the church order was ever any better. But having things on paper is never enough. And what we have to recognize is that the best documents will be vain unless the Lord works. And in that sense, I think we need to be much more than we have been people of prayer. And I think there is a dangerous Reformed tendency to say, God is sovereign. He'll accomplish all things according to the counsel of His will. He doesn't need advice from me. And there's a certain piety to that. It's just that it's not biblical. Because God is not sovereign like a machine. He's sovereign like a father. And He delights in the conversation of His children. And I think one of the things that I have learned to love the most in the Psalter is that I've been encouraged to say things to God that I would never have dared say left to myself. I am much more pious than the psalmist, which is a dangerous thing. We dare not be more pious than the Bible. We need to be pious like the Bible. And American evangelicalism is full of pious actions and convictions that have no relationship to the Bible. Listen how Psalm 44 closes. Psalm 44 is a fascinating psalm. It begins by remembering how God had blessed his people and fought for his people in times past. And then it goes on to say, you're not doing that for us any longer, God. You're not fighting for us anymore. You've allowed us to be disgraced. We've become a byword and a proverb and a scorn and a taunting of the nations. And then, in harmony with other psalms, we might expect the psalmist today so we repent. But the psalmist doesn't say that in Psalm 44. The psalmist says, all this has come upon us, verse 17, though we have not forgotten you, and though we have not been false to your covenant. Now, most of us are pious enough Reformed Christians, we would never say that to God. We are very quick to say we have been false to his covenant, we haven't been faithful as we ought to be. And that's true of most of us. But there are instances in the history of the church where the church has been able to say, we have been faithful to God. Paul, in 1 Thessalonians 2:10, says to the Thessalonian church, I was holy and righteous and blameless among you. Now, what does he mean? That he was absolutely sinless? No, he doesn't mean that. He means I was a faithful pastor to you. And this psalm is saying, we have been faithful as your people before you. And yet you have forgotten us. You haven't kept your promise to us. It's a kind of shocking psalm. And then it closes in prayer, where the psalmist says to God, awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Would you ever say that to God? I wouldn't. I'm too pious for that. It's interesting when you read Calvin's commentary on these verses, he gets very nervous. Calvin is a little bit stoical when it comes to emotions. He doesn't want too much emotion. And he's a little nervous about this. But there it is. Awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? God doesn't forget anything, does he? So what's being said here? What's being said is, we feel like you've forgotten us. For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our belly clings to the ground. Rise up and come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. Do we ever pray like that? Do we ever pray with that urgency, with that passion, with that remembering of the steadfast love of the Lord that never fails? But beseeching the Lord with passion that he'll come and help us. We need to pray that way for our young people. We need to pray that way for the lost that surround us. And we don't know how the Lord will answer prayer. We don't know what the purposes of the Lord are. But we do know that unless the Lord builds the house, they who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guards stay awake in vain. It is not without our working that the Lord usually accomplishes his purposes. But it is not by our working alone that he accomplishes purposes. So what I would encourage you to think more about us being a praying people. Now, I don't know how we do that exactly. One of the things we notice that many of our evangelical friends do is have prayer meetings. And I think it's not a bad idea to have prayer meetings. But I think often in evangelical circles, prayer meetings descend into a kind of grim duty, where usually the preacher spends most of the time preaching and there's relatively little time for prayer. I know we're not good at spontaneity, but I'd like to see us have a little more spontaneity in praying and coming together to pray with an urgency that the Lord would hear us and bless us and use us. I think we have great things to offer to people in a needy world. And we need the Spirit of God to take us and take what we have to carry it out and to bless it. So that's all I have to say tonight. And probably have said more than I know, but you've been very attentive, and it's been a delight to be with you. And if we have time for questions and answers, I'd be glad to